The column and its baggage train passed through the northern gatehouse of the island fortress and crossed over the bridge that spanned over the harbor. It had a drawbridge of the same sort as the southern gatehouse on both ends. Alessia stood again, leaning forward so far over the edge that Marcus worried that she would fall off if they hit a rough patch of road. Then he recalled that the bridge did not have any rough patches. It was laid with the same, seamless stone road as the rest of the highway. "Brother Marcus," Alessia exclaimed, "have you seen the like?" He couldn't say that he had. There were a myriad of common ideas represented by what stretched out below either side of the bridge, but someone had combined them in ways that he had never seen done before elsewhere. Many towns and cities were founded on rivers and built harbors that took advantage of them, but he had never seen an entire stretch of the river purposely re-engineered into one. The northern riverbank was a wall fashioned from blocks of grey stone that stretched the entire length of the town, looking to be a good 10 meters above the waterline. Rather than being built along the banks as one would usually see in river settlements, the harbor was actually above the river and inside the walls of the town. There were 2 pairs of locks on either end that elevated vessels between the river and the berthing areas on the warehouse level, creating a fortified harbor. Curiously, there were no ships in sight at all. "What is a harbor with no vessels?" he muttered to himself. "That's a good question," the driver said, "but I don't doubt that House Corlin has some plan in mind. There's only one large vessel and a handful of small boats on the river at the moment, but as you can see this harbor is meant to handle hundreds of ships. Rumor has it that the Countess is going to connect all of the riverlands by water. Some even speculate that she's going to start a route between the Sorceress Kingdom and the ports around the sea in the southeast." "The undead in Katza might have something to say about that," Alessia quipped. "Not if the ships are crewed by undead," the driver replied. "The one vessel I mentioned has a skeleton crew. Literally. We use summons for violence, yet they are used here for industry and trade." The Sorceress Kingdom certainly had a different paradigm when it came to employing the undead. Marcus wondered if there was any difference between a skeleton sailor and a skeleton warrior. "Does the Katza River see severe flooding?" Marcus asked. "It floods for a good 2 to 3 months out of the year," the driver replied. "The warehouse level of the city is well above the highest mark of the seasonal floods and it's a nice and secure harbor on top of that. The locks on either end raise and lower ships between the river and the harbor. That is a lot of water to move. How do they do it?" There should be a reservoir somewhere. Undead work the pumps to keep it filled." Marcus could not see any structures that looked like reservoirs, and the town appeared seamless in construction as his search turned upwards. Aside from the expansive harbor district with its rows of warehouses, Corlin Harbor had 2 other main sections within the confines of its walls. There was a central area where the spire of the town's temple rose above the surroundings. The other buildings appeared to either be commercial or industrial in function. The raised area which radiated outwards to the outer walls were dotted with residential buildings and pleasant-looking green spaces. The place appeared to have been purpose-built as a major hub for the future river transportation network that the driver had hinted at. Marcus realized that both the border town and the town they had stayed overnight at had a similar feel to them, and it now occurred to him why they were called villages rather than towns. They were deceptively large due to their purposeful design. The number of people actually living in them was far less than it appeared. Even Corlin Harbor could be mistaken for a small city at a glance, but after understanding its layout, he guessed that it would only count as a large town in terms of its population. "This all seems quite ambitious," Marcus remarked as he looked down thoughtfully at the features below the highway. "Well, that's a noble fear," the driver said. "Just because they aren't plotting and scheming against one another doesn't mean they aren't plotting and scheming about other things. I'd say us common folk prefer it this way over the other." As the driver had mentioned earlier, the highway was a merchant stream, the settlements built along it purpose-built to facilitate trade and industry. The highly specialized planning and its advanced construction spoke of a much more progressive nation that had taken the place of what was formerly Riestais. Never mind the overwhelming fortifications that faced the river, the sheer economic might represented in a nation that could create this was a clear sign to any visiting dignitary that getting on the Sorceress Kingdom's good side was a desirable thing. Corlin Harbor was the honey and the whip, expressed in the form of a single town. How long has this harbor town been under construction? Marcus was still puzzled over the sheer amount of new construction that was present. Construction started about midway through spring, the driver replied. Marcus swept his gaze over the shore and up the valley. The groundwork and formation of just the port area was something that should have taken many years, even with the assistance of golems.
All this in under half a year, he said flatly.
Was the river naturally like this? It was the only thing Marcus could think of that might shave so much from this huge project. Even then, he decided it would have still needed more using the methods he was aware of.
No, the driver scratched his head.
The original harbor village is further upriver. Countess Corlin decided to charter a new town here because it's where the highway is. So she just decided to do this, and everything we see was done in a handful of months. How? With magic? The driver seemed surprised that Marcus was surprised. I was heading out to the Empire when it happened, so I only heard about it. The entire thing was announced in advance so that people could come watch, so asking around for a bit will probably land you with a personal account. Magic that shaped earth and stone was not uncommon, but the sheer scale displayed was beyond what was capable by a single magic caster in such a short time frame. How many it would take to manage this, he couldn't estimate. In addition to the applications in civil engineering demonstrated before them, the strategic and tactical advantages from being able to wield this power could not be understated. Fortresses and highways might be able to spring into existence in the time it took for an army to march from one place to another. The column slowed once more as it approached the end of the second bridge, and Alessia finally sat back down. The sentries at the gate again appeared to be a pair of militia with a pair of death knights, and this time they were stopped at the gatehouse. Looking up at the battlements above, he saw the heads of elder liches and death warriors peering down at them with their crimson gazes. The contingent's painfully exposed position on the bridge underlined just how vulnerable any attackers would be. The death warriors on the bridge had all manner of ranged weaponry, and he did not doubt that their heavy crossbows, long javelins and wicked throwing axes could penetrate even their enchanted mithril plate. The elder liches were in position to rain all manner of magical destruction onto their heads. A dozen seconds passed before they started moving again, and Marcus released a breath he didn't even realize he was holding. He glanced over to Alessia to see how she was doing. Instead of looking at the undead as they passed them by, she was examining the militia instead. Is it possible these sentries are not humans? The girl leaned over and whispered to Marcus, some undead appear much the same as the living. I imagine there would be much running and screaming going on if any of what we have seen appeared at home. She turned her attention to the bent back of the driver, running a suspicious eye over him. Marcus hoped that she wasn't about to try and violently prove her hypothesis. Light cure wounds. Alessia suddenly cast a healing spell on the driver. The glow of the magic washed over the crooked frame of the man before fading away. Oh, my back was getting sore. The driver shifted in his seat. Thanks for that, miss. Of course, Alessia smiled brightly. I am glad to have provided some comfort. It is the least I can do for your being so amenable to our endless questions. Marcus shook his head wordlessly. Alessia was an exceptional paladin and a cunning tactician, but this cunning manifested as something of a sly nature when not in battle. In human lands, it was not illegal to cast beneficial magic. As a member of the temples, she was lawfully entitled to do so. Outwardly, she had provided the driver with something that had a rated value in exchange for his cooperative attitude. In actuality, she was checking to see if he would take damage from the healing spell. He wondered what would have happened if the man was something like a vampire instead. Were healing spells considered offensive magic in this land with so many undead? If you do that to a death knight, Marcus muttered, you will become a squire again. Surely you jest, brother. Her gaze slid away. Why would I do such a thing? It occurred to him that this might be the reason Alessia was specifically chosen for whatever she was to do. The temples kept careful track of populations under their jurisdiction, and her traits and strengths would be specially noted. Perhaps his worries for her were needless, and she was actually the most suited out of all of them to serve here. Paladins were generally perceived as virtuous, just and straightforward, for good reason, as this was usually the case. Alessia was all of these things, but she was also rather flexible. Hopefully, they didn't think to employ her as some sort of spy. She was still a paladin, after all. With this new perspective to account for, however, Marcus was becoming increasingly curious about what the bishop had in mind for her. Will we be parking our wagons the same way as yesterday evening? Marcus asked. Yeah, the driver answered. We'll be using the area on the east side of the port district. Traffic going south parks on the other side.
This can't be more than 2 hours from Erantal, Marcus noted.
Why would anyone stop here in favor of the city?
The harbor had no special activity that I could see. To keep traffic from piling up in the city, the driver replied. It used to be that all trade coming through here went into Erantal, but now that it's the capital of the Sorceress Kingdom, the city's going to get more traffic than it was designed for. They're gonna have to figure something out before it gets bad.
Do you really think so?
Being ruled by an undead sovereign seems like a great deterrent to trade. You'll forgive my saying so, the driver said, but that ain't how it works.
As long as it's safe and the borders remain open to trade, someone will move things around as long as it's worth it.
Even if no one from outside the country does it,
someone from ours will do it instead. Lady Wagner would be ecstatic if she could become the sole purveyor of goods in and out of the Sorceress Kingdom, but that's nothing more than a silly dream. Merchants that let their competitors gain an advantage like that for no reason don't stay merchants for long.
Marcus decided that the experienced teamster would know more about the workings of trade than a paladin from the theocracy. Having hostiles along 2/3 of their borders, trade in his home nation was largely domestic. None would risk going out into non-human nations to trade, and non-humans obviously did not go to trade in the theocracy. Out of all their neighbors, only the Draconic Kingdom, a few human nations to the south, and the Sorceress Kingdom in the north had open borders.
How does this town function in relation to Erantal, then?
Marcus asked.
It's basically a cargo port,
the driver answered.
Trade is conducted in Erantal, but only goods that need to be delivered to Erantal go in. When purchases are made that will travel in this direction, the goods are prepared here. That way we don't have unmanageable amounts of freight trying to constantly enter and exit the city itself.
Travel in this direction, you say?
Yeah, Lady Wagner's chartering another town out east for the same reason. Once enough pressure is taken off of Erantal, they can finally begin repurposing more of the city without interfering with its daily business. Marcus looked up north to the horizon, at the walls of the fortress city. Erantal appeared to be quite a large city, but as far as he knew, it was built as a fortress to project Riestize's power over the crossroads of the region. The repurposing the driver spoke of must have been to transform it into something more suited to be the capital city of a nation.
You didn't mention any town such as this to the west.
As far as I know,
there isn't one in the works yet, the driver said.
Riestize has been pretty quiet since they lost this duchy. When the Sorceress Kingdom did their big thing to get trade flowing again, barely anyone from Riestize appeared. Even House Wagner's former affiliates were absent. I'm fairly certain that Lady Wagner would have encouraged them to come.
Well, they did suffer a devastating defeat, after all, Marcus told him. Being invited to the land that you just lost might be a bit much.
Maybe, the driver said dubiously, but merchants don't think that way and most of House Wagner's associates are merchants. Merchant companies in the kingdom sent caravans to the theocracy and the empire before all this. I can't imagine them giving it all up if there's nothing stopping them from going back to business as usual.
Putting it that way, it did seem out of character for merchants. A few months was not a very long time. Perhaps they had simply not recovered from their nation's loss, or the fear of what awaited them in Erantal kept them at bay. The reaction in the theocracy was just as adverse in the first few months, and they did not even participate in the conflict. Marcus and Alessia watched silently as the driver expertly handled his team of horses to exit out the side of the highway down a shallow ramp. The warehouse district stretched out to either side of the highway after their route passed through the massive tower that served as the town's southern gatehouse. Ramps joined it to the main thoroughfare. The highway was level with the town's central district, bisecting the residential area and exiting out of another gatehouse in the north. The procession came to a large area on the harbor level that was similar in appearance to where they had left their wagons in the previous village. Rows of warehouses could be seen nearby, as well as the berths stretching along the channels of the harbor. Though the amount of activity was probably about right for a town straddling a major highway, the sheer size of the port made it appear barely used. "You said this is the final stop for the wagons?" Alessia asked. "That's right, miss," he replied. "We're to keep your extra baggage overnight. You can pick everything up in the morning when you're ready to go." "Then, this is appropriate, yes?" She withdrew a small purse from her belt and held it out beside him. "This is." The driver looked down and grinned. "I've always heard that the theocracy raises their ladies right and proper, and it seems that it's true.
Thank you,
miss. You have shown us great hospitality and patience, beyond our expectations for the journey.
She returned his smile with one of her own.
It is only right to express our gratitude.
Marcus and Alessia parted ways with the teamster before he parked their wagon, shouldering their bags and heading towards the area where the other paladins were assembling near the ramp leading up to the highway. They crossed a pair of town militia in House Corlin's livery, and Marcus caught their attention. "Excuse me," he called out to them, "do you two work in the harbor?" The men slowed their pace and stopped to answer.
"We're just out doing our rounds," one said.
"Is there something we can help you with, brother?" A large caravan of merchants should have just come from the south recently. One with a large escort. "Do you have some business with them?" "I heard that this place was where they keep cargo from the south," Marcus explained, "but I do not see a large number of wagons here. Did something happen?"
"Ah, those merchants didn't stop to do business in the city," the man said. "They stayed the night here and left for the Empire in the morning."
Marcus furrowed his brow. He did not know too much about how merchants operated, but he did understand enough that this behavior was irregular. "Is this normal for Iranthal?"
"Gods, no," the man let out a short laugh.
"What sane merchant would skip a perfect stop on their route? Huge waste of time, money, and wagon space. I know the toll is cheap and all, but that's just ridiculous." Seeing how large their escort was, they were probably just too scared to go in and decided to move on. Their loss. Marcus thanked the men and he joined the rest of the contingent. The captain was already starting to address them, so he slipped quietly into the rear. "We will be parting ways with our wagons here and riding to Iranthal in the morning. Once you settle on your accommodations, drop off all of the things that you will need there. You are free to look around the town, but be sure that you are ready to go an hour after daybreak." "Should we stick with our parties from yesterday, Captain?" someone asked. "If there were not any issues, it is not a bad idea," Lorenzo nodded. "This is our last chance to get used to how things work here before we receive our assignments. I heard of no troubles from last night, but be sure to conduct yourself in a manner befitting one who will soon be serving the people." Lorenzo waved them away, and the group quickly dispersed. Marcus joined the captain as he turned to follow the harbor back towards the highway. "Where is Sister Alessia?" Lorenzo turned his head about. Marcus frowned and looked around. He was so used to having Alessia about that he had assumed she was nearby. Just before turning back to see if she had been left behind, he caught a glimpse of her skipping ahead of the rest. "No longer so shy, Lorenzo said. "She must be up to something," Marcus muttered as she disappeared around the corner towards the town center. "I should probably keep an eye on her." "Should you?" His friend raised an eyebrow as they walked along. "Maybe you are being protective of your former squire. Just yesterday you asked if she truly wanted to hang around us, now you are wondering what she will do alone." Was Lorenzo right? It shouldn't be the case. "Rather than being protective, I am anxious about the troubles she will cause if left alone. Remember that she has her own assignment waiting for her in the city. If she cannot handle herself in this town, then, well, maybe keeping an eye on her from a distance is better." Two middle-aged men tailing a teenage girl, Marcus grumbled. "How far have the paladin orders fallen, I wonder?" "I was not serious about following her," Lorenzo smirked. "All squires must go their own way someday, old friend. You cannot watch over them forever." Marcus twisted his mouth as he considered Lorenzo's words. Alessia was his first squire, but probably not his last. A thought occurred to him. "Did you have a squire before this assignment, Lorenzo? Or any of these others here?" "Now that you mention it, no, mine was ordained 2 months ago. The others?" Lorenzo knotted his brows, then his eyes widened. "Are you saying that we will be taking new squires here?" "That is precisely what I am thinking. By training those born in these lands instead of bringing with us our own, they will raise paladins absent of the attitudes present in the theocracy. The foundation of a new paladin order, perfectly suited for their mission to deliver the light of the Six to the rest of these northern lands. This Bishop Hostine is more shrewd than we thought, fulfilling so many objectives at once." "Well, we will not know for sure until tomorrow," Lorenzo replied. "But if it is the case, what do you think?" Marcus mulled over their assignment and the state of the temples in the Sorceress Kingdom. Everything appeared to fit into place. There were no paladins here, and they were in dire need of staff.
All of the paladins on this mission not only qualified for temple duties, but they were all of an age that they had had at least one squire already. The sole exception was Alessia, who just happened to have a unique assignment of her own. The others would be encouraged to take new squires as a matter of course, maybe several since they already had experience raising one. The rest would inevitably follow in time.
"Do you think the High Council is aware?" Marcus asked.
"The Grand Masters? They are not fools," Lorenzo answered. "Of course they would have considered this."
"Then I will do my duty," Marcus said firmly. "If a new order is to be formed here for the furtherance of the faith and the reclamation of the North, I can think of no cause more just. However, I pray that I do not get assigned more girls just because I had Alessia." "You don't think they are more manageable than boys?"
"No,"
Marcus snorted. "You should volunteer yourself for this and suffer what I have for all these years."
Lorenzo chuckled at his words, and they continued on their way to the town center. There was a raised walkway on either side of the newly paved highway, wide enough to fit 4 grown men shoulder to shoulder. Tall street lamps, brightly enchanted, could be seen lining their route. Contrary to the bridge and island fortifications, not many undead could be seen standing sentry, but there was still a fair number moving about on various errands. The townsfolk appeared to pay no more attention to them than anything else as they conducted their business. By following the temple spire, they found themselves in a market plaza, a much larger version of the village squares they had seen on the way north. A large temple complex with the same, unassuming appearance as he had seen in the previous villages stood on the western end, while various trade guild offices were arranged around the space. An administrative office lay across from the temple, and there were a few other official-looking buildings with signs that he did not recognize. Marcus spotted Alessia up ahead, staring at the front of one of the offices with an unfamiliar sign.
"Something interests you, Sister Alessia?"
Lorenzo asked as they walked up to where she stood.
"I am wondering what this is for." She gestured towards the building. Marcus peered into the open door. There was a woman of pale beauty wearing some sort of dark blue outfit standing behind a counter. Above the door hung a large signboard. He leaned over to one side to get a better view. A white rectangle with a pink heart in the center was engraved on the lacquered wood. On either side of it was carved the membranous swing from a bat, or perhaps a wyvern. No matter how long he stared at it, he couldn't discern what it symbolized. A young man with a loaded handcart stopped in front of the building and carried several boxes into the office. Marcus strained his ears, but could not make out what was being discussed. After a few seconds, some papers were placed before the man and he leaned over to write on them. In the end, he left with a different set of containers and a smile on his face.
A trade?
A delivery?
It could have been several common things.
"You are not going in to satisfy your curiosity?"
Lorenzo asked Alessia.
"Me, Captain. I have no business here. What if she becomes angry? We should ask one of the townsfolk around."
Alessia looked about, but there was no one to speak to nearby.
"Come now," Lorenzo said, "there is no harm in asking.
It is not as if Clark spite people for having a question. That man just now seemed quite pleased,
so she should be a nice person, yes? MMH. After a moment's hesitation, Alessia fixed an awkward smile on her face and walked into the door. "You people from Altamura are so shy," Lorenzo chuckled.
"It is a fortress," Marcus said.
"I do not know what you expect when we come to places like this."
"Well, at least she is not so nervous that she cannot even book an inn," Lorenzo said.
"You just stood outside that one for 2 hours when we first met." "She survived her visit to the capital." Marcus ignored his jibe, "though I do not know how she fared, exactly." Alessia stopped in the doorframe, looking around the interior of the office before her legs carried her inside. She started talking to the woman, but she was standing several meters away from the counter as she did so. At some point in their conversation, she went as stiff as a board and just as stiffly walked back out. The woman at the counter tilted her head curiously at them.
"This one,"
Alessia spoke through the smile still frozen on her face, "she is a vampire." Marcus and Lorenzo looked back into the office. The vampire smiled back at them. "What is a vampire do? You said that Clarks don't bite." "She bit you?" "No, but, RRRGH.
Next will be the ghost in the latrine, I know it."
Alessia rummaged around in her bag, fishing out her clasp. Marcus wasn't sure how it would help her. There were enough undead around that it would be informing her constantly of them. What is this office, then? Lorenzo asked. You are not going to tell me that they purchase blood, I hope.
It is a post office.
A post office? Marcus' voice was flat. Yes, Alessia snapped. There are even rates listed on the walls inside. Some I recognize, Rantel, Winter, most I do not know, but some sound like local places. Dwarf cities as well, this vampire said. I wonder if I can send some letters home, Lorenzo mused. Do you think they will let a vampire cross the border to deliver mail? Marcus was incredulous. The moment one appears they will be turning houses inside out looking for vampire spawn for the next year. It was a joke, Marcus, Lorenzo said. If you look at everything with the utmost severity here, you will be panicking at every corner. We should find an inn and fill our bellies. Marcus and Lorenzo continued on their way, but Alessia turned to walk in a different direction. Sister Alessia? Marcus looked back at her. You two go on ahead, I will find my own way. You were so reluctant to enter this post office, yet now you are striking out on your own so boldly. What are you up to? Nothing important. Marcus looked around the square again, and his eyes fell upon an impressive-looking establishment that stood out from the ones around it. It was roughly in the direction of Alessia's steps. The young paladin did not miss his look, and she turned around and strode away. Wait a minute, Marcus rushed up and placed a hand on her shoulder. What did I say about relying too much on House Corlin's favor? But this is the last night we will have these, yes? Alessia whined, it is a shame to not use them. What sort of squire did I raise? A smart one. What of living a humble life within simple means? Our order does not require an oath of poverty. Why would an orphan like me take an oath of poverty anyways? Only the crazy do this, and it makes them even crazier. What is wrong with a normal room? A normal room is small. It does not have the soft, four-poster bed with the silk sheets, or the hot baths and the sumptuous meals, which I could not partake of this morning, mind you. Alessia tugged against his grip. Several bystanders whispered to one another out of the corner of his eye. You should let her go, Lorenzo spoke in low tones at his side. This is not a very defensible scene. Marcus released Alessia's shoulder, and she darted away. The girl looked over her shoulder and stuck out her tongue at him. I must have been too soft in raising her, Marcus muttered. What sort of paladin chooses such a decadent place to stay? Well, nothing is specifically said against it, Lorenzo said. I believe you have raised her well. Her heart appears to be in the right place, and it does not hurt to have something nice once in a while. The temple bell tolled, filling the air over the town and calling the faithful to evening prayer. People appeared from the surrounding streets to head there, and within minutes a score of townsfolk streamed towards its open doors. Come, let us attend, Lorenzo, Marcus sighed. I have many worries to cast upon the mercy of the gods. Morning arrived, and Marcus and Lorenzo found Alessia already outside in the plaza upon leaving their lodgings. Fully attired in her shining mithril plate mail, the young paladin cradled her helmet in the crook of her left arm as the edges of her pure white mantle waved in the wind. Her voice was light and cheery as she greeted them with a bow. A blessed morning to you, Captain Lorenzo, Brother Marcus. They returned her greeting, and Marcus wondered how far she had gone with her use of the mithril plaque. She presented an immaculate appearance that would only entrench the notion of a righteous paladin in the minds of the citizens around her. Long having known the girl, however, how perfect her appearance was only drew suspicion. You look all ready to go, Lorenzo said. Yes, Captain, Alessia saluted. As instructed, I have made myself presentable for inspection by His Excellency the Bishop. Good, the captain replied, giving her a brief once-over. If everyone looks even half as decent, I will have no complaints. Are we ready to assemble, or do either of you need to see to anything? I am ready to depart, Captain, Alessia replied. Marcus examined her with a critical eye again. Was she just excited to arrive at their destination, or was she up to some mischief? Marcus? Lorenzo's voice prodded him out of his thoughts. Yes, ready to go, Captain. All right, Lorenzo said. Head back to the port district and ready your mounts. See to mine as well, I will be waiting here to bring up the rear. They saluted the captain again before turning to head back down to the port. As they followed the raised sidewalk along the highway, Marcus glanced at Alessia again.
You seem just a bit too enthusiastic this morning, he said. Was this inn you stayed at so good? To his surprise, her bright expression faltered and crumbled. She faced him with a look lacking all of its previous luster. I could not enjoy it, she said quietly. I kept thinking of what would happen today. I just lay abed staring at nothing, worrying.
Worrying? About what?
We go to meet His Excellency the Bishop today, yes?
Yes,
Marcus replied,
but we have a bishop in Altamura, and we saw him often enough.
You seem to not mind His Excellency, even when he chased you around with a broom. The reminder of her days as a squire failed to draw any visible reaction out of Alessia. Her expression remained as troubled as before. This is true, but that was at home, in a place comforting and familiar. Before now, everything was so clear. Our duty was to defend humanity. To defend humanity, we needed to fight. Now, the answer is not so simple. Now, I have been summoned for some unknown purpose, and I still cannot guess what it is. The words of the priestess at the border, they made me realize that we have been thrust into this strange place where the fates of tens of millions of our lost brothers and sisters hinge on our actions. How can I step forward knowing that if I step wrongly, all may be lost forever? Several wagons passed below as Marcus listened to her worries. You are being too hard on yourself, Sister Alessia. I am confident you can face what comes, else why would they choose you? He struggled to come up with something encouraging to say, but any words that rose in his mind rang hollow, for he was not so sure of everything himself. Maybe the answer is not so complex as you think, Marcus said. Brother Marcus? When you were ordained, when you took your oath, what did you swear? Let us not recite the whole thing, but what did it mean to you? Alessia looked ahead, her gaze focused on something that was only visible to her. To be the shield of humanity, she told him. A defender of the faith. A living instrument of the gods that stands between the people and those who would bring upon them ruin, a hand that reaches out to them in their time of need. Then this is the foundation of the justice which you have sworn to uphold, Marcus said. No matter what you do, it is the core of what you are. Do you think it's so easy to turn away from your convictions? When injustice happens before your eyes, can you bear to look the other way? I could not, Brother Marcus. Just so, he smiled. Though the way you perceive the world will shift over the years, this sense of righteousness will never change. To seek justice and uphold it, to be an example to all, an inspiration to all, this is the essence of being a paladin. You are right that this place is not like home and nothing is clear, but here, where half of everything is turned upside down, you are the best of us. You are not only blessed with a strong bloodline, but the gods have gifted you with keen judgment and a sharp mind. The bishop and the grand masters must also know this. I cannot think of any other reason why they would choose you in particular. Despite his encouragement, Alessia frowned as she looked down at the pathway and thought. They continued on in silence, descending to the harbor level and crossing under the highway to where their horses were being stabled. The wagons that had carried them through Corlin County were already absent, and their things were arranged nearby under the watchful eye of several of the town militia. There was a Death Knight present as well, who seemed to scrutinize everyone that came close. A handful of paladins were already there, making ready for the last part of their journey to the city. Marcus walked up to his mount, a handsome chestnut stallion who had been his companion for over half a decade. Did you enjoy your break? Marcus asked as he patted him in greeting. I wonder what you have to say of all this, His steed only snorted in reply. Maybe he was resentful for being put back to work again. Marcus continued preparing his mount as more of the contingent arrived. Alessia led her roan to stand near him. Do you know if we are to enter the city armed? She asked. I have heard nothing to the contrary, Marcus said. It would have been stated clearly, I think. You are nervous, I know, but remember what I said. Of course, brother, Alessia said. I have taken your words to heart. I am just feeling that everything will be blamed on us if anything happens. It did feel that way, he supposed. It was a place full of things that they were unused to, and there seemed to be much that was not permitted. Those that they spoke to only saw it as a natural part of their lives, but to the paladins who came from a place where the temples held purview in enforcing order, it was anything but. It is their land and their laws, he said. There have been no incidents so far, so the others seem to understand this well enough. We are to serve the human populations here, anyway. If the days that have passed are like the days ahead, it should be manageable. If, Alessia replied, we have not even seen the demi-humans that are supposed to be around yet. If a stinky ogre reaches out for me, I will definitely give him a good whack, no matter what anyone says. Alessia. To think that she was considered the mildest of her generation in Altamura, he counted it a blessing that no one had brought any squires along. Lorenzo appeared with the last few paladins, and Marcus tensed as they organized their mounts into a tidy double column. The others must have felt the same way, judging by their stiff expressions. Their captain rode by and paused midway, his gaze taking a measure of his men. Half of you look like your horse just died, his gruff words rolled over them, and the other half like your horse just died in the middle of the Katza Plains and you must make your way out on foot. We are about to present ourselves before His Excellency the Bishop of Irantal. If we come in looking all grim and dour, he is going to be wondering if he is the right people or not. You have from here until the city to fix that. By the time we reach the gates, I expect to see all of you reflecting the pride and conviction of the Paladin orders. Lorenzo rode towards the head of the column and sounded the advance. The banners tied to their lances snapped straight as they ascended onto the highway and turned into the wind. Through the center of Corlin Harbor they rode, the procession of mounted paladins in their full adornment drawing curious looks from the townsfolk they passed. Maybe I should have bought more pastries, Alessia said as she rode beside him. You were so worried. Now you are thinking of food? I'm still worried, but having something nice might improve my mood. Did you just not spend all of last night worrying amidst luxury? Perhaps she was just putting on a brave face. Reaching down behind herself to rummage through a saddlebag, Alessia produced a strip of tough-looking jerky. After the last few days, Alessia examined the piece of salted meat with a critical eye. This does not seem so appetizing anymore. What did you bring, Brother Marcus? The same, he replied. Some trail bread and cheese as well. We will be in the city in an hour or two. Anyways, if the layout of the city is like these places, there should be plenty of food stands around the temple to pick from. The thought appeared to mollify her somewhat. After a few minutes, they were out of the town's northern gate, following the highway past rows of vineyards that stretched out to the horizon on either side. Traffic appeared sparse until they reached the crossroads. It was a strange sight, with the new highway crossing south over the old. Stranger still since the road running from east to west clearly saw more use. Their pace slowed to match the caravan in front of them, then that slow pace came to a stop. Marcus leaned out to see what was going on. Ahead, the members of the contingent were starting to dismount. What is going on? He called out. Traffic, one of the paladins ahead replied. A few minutes later, they had all dismounted, leading their horses on foot and gathering to speak between themselves. Every few minutes, they shifted forward a few wagon lengths. It wasn't exactly slow, but... I want my tension back. Alessia complained as she drew her mantle about her. We could not charge this gate even if we wanted to. We only get to stand around baking in the sun while we wait for this queue. It is already autumn. Do clouds not exist in this country? It certainly was one way to dampen any sort of excitement. The measures that the Sorceress Kingdom was taking in building towns that absorbed the majority of incoming freight made a lot more sense now that they were stuck waiting to get into the city. All cities were built to facilitate trade, but there was only a certain volume that a fortress city like Irantal could allow before it would need to sacrifice the effectiveness of its defenses. It was certainly not built to be the bustling capital of a nation. Looking forward and back, he only saw human merchants and caravan laborers. Occasionally, a solita with its wagon came down in the opposite direction hauling mundane-looking cargo. They were as often driverless as they had drivers. Marcus wondered if they, too, had to go through customs on the way in. As they drew within 2 kilometers of the gate, the chatter between the paladins fell to nothing and the atmosphere grew solemn. Marcus was no different, and Alessia's lips had tightened into a thin line. The banners of the slain theocracy snapped smartly in the wind, in contrast with their grim expressions. Marcus' gaze went to the source of the change. What he had observed of the temple staff and the people in the past few days slowly fell into place, like pieces of a previously unfathomable puzzle. How had nothing of this gotten to the theocracy? Anyone who had visited the ancient cathedrals of their homeland knew this appearance. His eyes left the towering statues, briefly crossing with Alessia's. As with everyone else, she gave no indication of her thoughts, but they must have been there. Everyone knew, but none dared put it into words.
They crawled forward for an hour under the familiar image portrayed by the towering statues before finally reaching the gatehouse. There were several members of the city militia stationed there, as well as a pair of death knights and an elder lich. One of the militia officers was discussing something with the elder lich, throwing occasional glances in their direction. Marcus left his reins with Alessia and walked up to the front. "Did something happen?" he asked Lorenzo. "Not that I know of," the captain replied. "We have not done or said anything aside from stewing in this line." Lorenzo tapped the roll of documents in his hand over his bracer, as if to silently make a point to the officer in front of them. After a few moments, the man that was speaking to the elder lich turned to approach them, taking a deep breath before speaking. "Welcome to Eranthal," he said, "city of the Sorceress Kingdom. I trust that this is your first time here?" "That is correct," Lorenzo replied. "Is something the matter?" "Not with your group in particular, no," the man told them. "However, there were several incidents with visitors recently that have become a cause of concern with the citizens. In response, we've prepared an orientation of sorts." "An orientation?" Lorenzo drew the word out. "Are you assuming that we carry the risk of such incidents in your city?" "We make no such assumptions," the man replied. "Nor do we assume that everyone is aware of how different this city is from what it was before. This orientation is for your benefit more than our own. Honestly, since you're so composed in front of the Death Knights, the orientation should be more of a workshop to give you a quick rundown of things and have some of your questions answered. However, it is mandatory. Entry to the city proper is barred until you've completed it." "Then I suppose that there is nothing to do but take you up on your offer," Lorenzo said. "Do you have a place for our horses?" "Yes, of course," the man replied. "This way please, there's a mustering field behind the office." He led them inside the gate, where they came across an odd sight. The main street continued to the second wall of the city, but the space between the outer and second wall was mostly quiet. The man had mentioned a mustering field, which Marcus had assumed to be an exaggeration, but he saw it was exactly that. A furrow formed on his brow at the sight of the dry patch of earth with its baked mud and sparse clumps of grass. Places where tents had once been pitched and the remains of campfires were still marked distinctly over the landscape. There were even rows of posts damaged in a way suggesting that they had been used for training spearmen. "What is this?" he muttered to Lorenzo. "It is as he said, I suppose?" the captain replied. Lorenzo's eyes scanned their surroundings with uncertainty as well. Marcus could see similar fields lining the avenue that curved off into the distance. Between them were either shoddy-looking warehouses or presumptuous-looking buildings that reminded him of rustic rural manners. "How is this place used?" Marcus asked their guide after dropping off his mount. "The military district?" The man turned to answer him. "The Royal Army stayed here during the annual skirmish back when we were still part of Riestais." Marcus' mouth fell open. Could it be that the manor-like structures were meant for the nobles who brought their levies, while the fields were where they put up their men? The clear difference in treatment between them must have had a staggering effect on morale. What were they thinking? Were they even thinking? There were rumors floating around the theocracy about the abhorrent state of Riestais as a nation, but after the last few days, he thought that these accounts might have been greatly exaggerated. The sight of this place made him once again reconsider. The entire district was also a colossal waste of space. His previous post of Altamura was a fortress that acted to guard against major incursions from both the Katza Plains and beastmen who could potentially break through the northern fringes of the Draconic Kingdom. It was also a training installation for the theocracy's regular army, so Altamura was close to fully manned at all times of the year. It shared no resemblance to this military district, save for the fact that it had walls. This place, by the way the man had described it and its apparent layout, was used to house Riestais' army on a temporary basis, a convenient lot of land where they stored their fighting men like so much livestock. Out of the corner of his eye, he could see Lorenzo shake his head wordlessly. He couldn't help but shake his head as well. They had just traveled through Calling County, with its sleek highway, expertly cultivated valleys and settlements of efficient and purposeful design, to this horrifying monument to impracticality and disregard for the well-being of their fellow man. Marcus resisted the urge to spit in disgust. "I would think that the Sorceress Kingdom has no need for this district," he said to the militia officer. "I heard that some changes were due." "Well, we try to use it in what ways we can for the time being, but you're right. His Majesty's army doesn't need this district, so I think they're just going to turn it into something else once they figure out what. I'm just a guy at the gate though, we ain't privy to all that sort of information. The man looked past Marcus and Lorenzo and cleared his throat in the dusty air. Looks like everyone's done tethering their horses, he said to the captain. I'll take you and your men over to the office now.